Welcome everyone, thank you all for coming out. My name is Steph, I'm the manager here at Street Bookstore. We are so delighted to have David W. Moore with us tonight. He's the author of Small Town, Big Oil, the Untold Story of the Women Who Took on the Richest Men in the World and Won. We're also so pleased to have two of those women with us tonight, Dudley Dudley and Nancy Sandberg. David W. Moore is an award-winning author and currently a senior fellow at the Carsey Center for Public Policy at the University of New Hampshire. He's also the polling director and frequent columnist for iMediaEthics.org, for which he won the 2015 Epi Award for his news and political commentary. Cool. For 21 years, he taught political science at UNH, and for the next 13 years, he worked at the Gallup organization as the senior editor of the Gallup poll. He became affiliated with UNH again in 2008. I lived in Durham for a few years myself, just a few doors down from you, Nancy, on Langley Road. And I can attest to what a beautiful community it is, both the Bay and the people. And this is truly a remarkable story, and one that David tells in a really fascinating way that you just can't put down. And it strikes me that it's such a perfect story for today, for 2018. And it's a story about women banding together to take on this huge industry for the sake of the environment and for the community of Durham and for the Great Bay. It's really an inspirational story. So please join me in welcoming David Moore to Water Street Bookstore.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you everybody for turning out. Thanks especially to the Water Street Bookstore, Stephanie, for all of for inviting us all to come out and have this presentation. This story is a great story, and I can see that a lot of people have really reacted positively to it, as they have over the years. In the 1990s, there was a brief 5-minute YouTube video that was put on, and Jim Horrigan was the person who made some comments about it. So I thought that it would be, by the way, it's called The Battle for Durham Point, D-U-R-H-A-N, but if you do want to go on and take a look, you can. But it is an interesting, although very brief, video. But in there, he starts off by saying, and this is really very important, New Hampshire is rich in natural beauty. Its 18 miles of beaches and rugged coastline are fed by a web of rivers and estuaries that fuel the economy for many New Hampshire communities. This is a story about legacy and how the actions of ordinary people can impact the lives of many for generations to come. It is also a story about recognition of the often underappreciated role that women play in society, and it is a story about today, balancing the reality of our energy needs and understanding our responsibility to our community and to our descendants. But to understand this responsibility, we must first take a step back into the past. And in the past, we're talking about 1973, that was a period in the worst recession since the Great Depression. Prices of foodstuffs had been soaring. The economic growth was sluggish or stagnant. There was high inflation, which led to a new term called stagflation. There was a fuel shortage with long gas lines, and there were high prices for food and for fuel. Into this maelstrom of bad economic activity came somebody who wanted to help us recover from the economic doldrums. Most people knew Aristotle Onassis, who was reputed to be the richest man in the world, mostly because he had just recently married, in 1968, married Jackie Kennedy, much to the chagrin, actually to the denigration of most people around the world. This is the man that most people thought of when they saw Aristotle Onassis. He was a ruthless, very, very successful businessman. Supporting him was another cast of characters, perhaps one of the most vile most vile human beings, I think, in New Hampshire that we've seen in the past 100 years, at least 50 years. And that was the publisher of the Manchester Union Leader. a bully, a man who went after not only politicians, he went after their wives, he went after their children. It was just an incredibly toxic political environment that existed in 1973. He hated the University of New Hampshire, and he admitted that of all the people that he didn't like, the one he hated most was Dudley Dudley. And supporting him was the puppet master, or the governor, Meldrum Thompson. Meldrum Thompson was a conservative in his own right, but he came to be governor because of the support of the Union leader. And he wanted an oil refinery, even though other states, New England states, were working to see what they could do. He didn't want that. He wanted to do it himself, and he didn't care one whit about the environment. Those were the people against whom Durham and the three women were fighting. So what he proposed to do, what Aristotle Onassis proposed, was an oil refinery on Durham Point. It would be 400,000 barrels of oil per day, which would have been the largest grassroots oil refinery in the country, ever. It was going to cost $600 million. It says 600,000, but it's $600 million. No, $600,000. $600 million, which would have been $3.2 billion today. So it's 600 million. But the promise it had was that there would be 15,000 new jobs. There would be more gas and home heating oil, and there would be a large tax break for Durham. Ultimately, all those promises were shown to be false, but those were the promises, and they sounded very good to most of the people. This is a kind of brief schematic of what the oil refinery would have looked like. It would have gone from Lunging Island, which is way over here, as you know, part of the Isles of Shoals, going across the water into it near Rye, and then would have gone straight over across land and then underwater into Durham. The black area is the area of Durham. The red area is the area that Onassis men had purchased options on. Ultimately, they would purchased options on some 3,000 acres, which represented over a quarter of the town. And it's not so much how much they took, it's what they would do with that area that was really frightening. This is what a schematic looked like. It supposedly was only going to use 1,200 of the 3,000 acres that they had purchased, but in the schematic there was no place shown where they would put the satellite petrochemical industry. And they had promised in the plan that they would have such industry, but it wasn't shown. This was a model that was presented by the Olympic people sometime after the campaign had begun, and it was shown ultimately to appear that here was a oil refinery that could be clean and could be contained, and nobody would even know it was there. That is, suppose if you couldn't smell or couldn't see, maybe you wouldn't know it was there. But anybody who's been around New Jersey and the oil fields there know that the smell of rotten eggs permeates the environment. So that's what it looked like. And let me go back just for a moment. You can see right down here is the oil refinery part, and these are the storage tanks. The oil refinery looks so small and contained until you take a look at what an actual oil refinery really looked like from the ground, and that's what was proposed. That is not, that is another oil refinery, but that is typical of what it would have looked like. So, our heroes to the rescue, starting off with Nancy Sandberg, who organized the town, who helped organize the town in its resistance. Dudley Dudley, who had an unenviable task of trying to rally the troops in the state legislature to prevent them from passing a law that would allow the state to impose an oil refinery on a town or a city that may not have wanted it. And the third hero is Phyllis Bennett. Phyllis Bennett was the publisher of a local newspaper that had only come into existence in August of 1973, but it was designed it was intended by her and her husband to be a newspaper that would provide local coverage because they themselves were journalists and had this dream of providing what they felt was a real absence of information to local communities. And fortunately for the Seacoast and for Durham, they decided to found their newspaper, Public Occurrences, to cover the Seacoast area, and particularly they were there when the oil refinement came about. So to start off the presentation, I've asked Nancy if she would come up and give us an idea of what it was like for her to suddenly emerge as the leader of the town. Nancy.
Thank you, David. Make my way around here without tripping over these wires. Good evening. It's so great to see so many people. This is an old story, but it's taken on a new life, I think, with David's book, and I'm delighted. But very happy to see you all here tonight. I imagine there are a number of people from Exeter who were very much involved way back then, because the oil refining would have had huge impacts on Exeter too. It's really hard to convey to you what it felt like in the summer of 1973 when the people on Durham Point suddenly realized that there were several people trying to get options on land, and we just realized they were up to no good. Neighbor talking to neighbor. It's not a densely populated spot. It's an area of old farms, and but we decided that they were up to no good and we needed to get to the bottom of it, so we decided to have a meeting. We met at the university and asked our town moderator if he would facilitate the meeting. The meeting went on until about 11 o'clock that evening. People started peeling away, but there was a core group left over, about 20 people, who hung in there. And we worked long and hard trying to think of a name for our group, and we were aware that in Rhode Island there was a group called Save the Bay, and they were fighting a refinery there, and someone said, well, how about Save Our Shores? And everybody said, well, it's okay, but it's not great, and we kept turning ideas over in our mind, and finally everybody was so tired that our neighbor, Elaine Schubert, said, I think Nancy Samber would make a great chairman of this committee. And everybody said, yeah, great idea, let's vote. And they voted, and by acclamation I was made leader of this group. Shocking. And I went home, woke up my husband, who was a teacher, and I woke him up and I said, I've just been made the head of a group that's like the Seacoast Anti-Pollution League, because that was the only other group I could think of that was going to be like this. And he said, don't worry, honey, you'll do fine. And he rolled over and went back to sleep. Well, that was the beginning of the end. It was a wild ride for the next 9 months. It was only a 9-month battle, but the most intense battle of my life. But that's how it all started. We didn't know what we were fighting when we first organized, but we knew that it was something that was not allied with the wishes of the people of Durham, because this area on Durham Point is the watershed for the bay, and we knew how important the bay, or if we didn't know exactly why it was so important, we soon learned about it. And so, but we knew we needed to be ready when we did find out. So it was really probably another month before we knew it was an oil refinery. And that was thanks to Phyllis Bennett and Public Occurrences. So that kind of gets us started, David. Is that good? I mean, I can talk long about this because we had to do, the great job was trying to organize ourselves as a fighting force to spread the word about the refinery. We knew that the more people that knew of it, we had to educate ourselves. Well, what is an oil refinery? I mean, Durham had never dreamed of anything like that for our town. We weren't zoned for it, but we soon, I know more about oil refineries than I ever thought I would know. But that gets the story going, I think.
Great, thank you. As Nancy says, there's a lot more for her to tell, and after we finish, if you have questions, Nancy or Dudley, definitely feel free. The next person to speak, of course, is Dudley. Dudley was the first-time legislative rep, the first female Democrat ever elected from Durham. This was at a time when we had 4 representatives, and they had all been Republicans since who knows when, back to the 20s. And so Dudley was the first Democrat since the 1920s to get elected. She went out and fought hard. And so suddenly she finds herself in the legislature, and now she's got the responsibility as a first-term legislator of trying to turn the state house, the House of Representatives, into a support for the town of Durham, or prevent them from going against the town. So, but Dudley's got a lot to say. So come on, Dudley.
Hello. I was a freshman state rep in 1973. I had not spoken on the floor of the legislature. I had sponsored no bills. I was just sort of learning how to get along. I was a real rookie. But I had some seasoned friends who helped me. And one day, shortly after I had been elected, a man named Marty Gross, who was a lawyer in Concord, New Hampshire, came to my house and we were talking at the kitchen table, sitting quietly there, and he said, if you ever want to get anything done in the New Hampshire legislature, use these 2 words, home rule. And at the time, I didn't think too much about it, but little did I realize what an important message he had given me. Because shortly after that, when the refinery became clear that it was going to be a refinery, and our selectmen took the very judicious path of not taking a stand, because they wanted to explore, they wanted to investigate, they wanted to educate themselves. They had every right to do all of those things. But I, as a state rep, I guess, thought I had the right to say no right from the beginning, as soon as the rumors started. The selectmen were not much help at all. And so it did fall on the legislature, really, to deal with the refinery. The legislature met in biennial sessions at that time, which meant every other year, but if there was an emergency or some special reason, it would meet every year. So it had to, any bill that was introduced in the second session had to show that it was responding to an emergency. So I looked up the meaning of the word emergency just to be sure that I knew what it was. And this is what I found. An unforeseen combination of circumstances that calls for immediate action and urgent need for assistance or relief. I successfully argued the point to the speaker, and he allowed that we could hear my bill. My bill was based on the concept of home rule. Now, home rule is not a noble concept, but it is one that almost all towns use in one way or another. For instance, if your town sells cigarettes, you have given permission in that town. It's up to the town to say whether or not it wants cigarettes or liquor or lottery tickets or a racetrack. All of those require a vote of the people of the town. And I thought that an oil refinery would be at least as intrusive as even a racetrack. So I believe that a community had the right to approve certain potentially intrusive activities. And I figured that an oil refinery would serve that definition. And so I introduced House Bill 18, a very simple bill which simply said this bill would require a vote of approval of a majority of the town's voters prior to the approval of a site plan for an oil refinery. It couldn't have been much simpler. Do you want me to go on?
Well, you also had the other bill that was...
Oh, there was also another bill that was introduced, not by me, but it was to establish an energy siting facility, an energy siting approval bill. That was House Bill 34. My bill was House Bill 18. And they were both voted on the same day. Shall I talk about the day
Spoiler
before?
alert.
Do.
Okay, the day before the vote in the legislature, there was a vote in the town. The town, Nancy Sandberg had the town on the edge of its seats. I think every person in town was there at the town meeting. The town meeting was ordinarily would have heard 40 or 50 items. That night, we were told we would hear only one, and it had to do with the oil refinery. The other items were heard later that week at a totally separate meeting. So Nancy Sandberg stood up, she gave an impassioned speech, and she got a standing ovation. Other people spoke. A man named Tommy Thompson gave the case for the people who were supporting the refinery. We had a wonderful moderator, Joe Michael, who at the very beginning pointed out that there was press and media there from all over the world, and that we would be on our best behavior and allow all points of view to be expressed, which we did. And then it was time for the vote. And we voted 9-1 in opposition to the refinery. I still wonder about those one. Who could they possibly have been? Anyway, but that, and we went home late that night, but that was the vote. The next day, my bill was scheduled to be heard in the legislature, and I have to say, it is honestly coincidence that it was the next day. It might have made a difference if it had been the day before, because when we went to the legislature to vote that day, all the legislators, all 400 of them, knew what had happened in Durham the night before. Although what happened in Durham had no legal binding effect, it had the huge effect of influencing the vote in the legislature the next day. It meant that people from Berlin and from Nashua and Manchester and Concord, who probably didn't think they would be affected by an oil refinery in Durham, realized that if it had been proposed for their town, and if their town did not want it as much as Durham did not want it, they would understand about home rule and would have supported my position. So House Bill 34, the citing bill, was voted down, which cleared the way for my bill, House Bill 18, and it was passed. And it was a great moment. Can I tell the story about going out to dinner? Okay. So to celebrate, we went out to dinner, Nancy and I and our spouses and friends, and other legislators who had supported this point of view. And we were sitting there just breathing deep sighs of relief when we looked across the room and there was a table of all of the consultants for the Onassis proposal. And then, and I'm thinking, oh no, I just really didn't want to see them. And then they stood up one by one and they came over in our direction. And I thought, oh, they're going to tell us. They're going to put it in Newmarket. Would have made no difference. It would have ruined the Seacoast. They're going to put it in Rochester. Rochester would have been happy to have it. They're going to put it in Sanford, Maine. Any of those would have had a very bad effect, not only on Durham, that wasn't our point, on the whole seacoast of this area. They came over one by one and they put out their hands and they said, we want you to know the right side won. And that was a high moment.
Well, when you hear Nancy and Dudley tell the story, you get an idea of the events that happened, but you don't really get an idea of the personal trauma that they went through. In the book, I do try to cover that. Unfortunately, Phyllis Bennett, who was, as I say, founded the Public Occurrences with her husband, included in Public Occurrences many interviews and stories that got at the problems that Nancy faced, that Dudley faced, and that others faced. So that you get more than just what were the events, but how did those people, how did Nancy and Dudley and Phyllis, how did they all deal with the stress and deal with essentially patriarchal environment that put women down, that at one point, as Nancy and both Dudley have told me, and it's in the book, they were called variously the little ladies of Durham, beating their little breasts, women who were dismissed as not knowing anything about environment and should essentially shut up. Well, Phyllis had Public Occurrences. Now you probably can't see it from there, but this is the key issue that alerted everybody in Durham to the oil refinery. It was in October 5th, 1973, and the story itself wasn't until page 3, but the question here is, an oil refinery on Durham Point? An attempted land grab causes a week of rumors. And that was really interesting because an attorney had called to Ron Lewis, who was the reporter at Public Occurrences, and told him that a lot of his clients had been approached by various people saying they wanted to buy the land. And so they did their own investigation, Public Occurrences did, and came up with a conclusion that it was probably related to the governor's avowed goal of having an oil refinery. So that was one of the key things that Public Occurrences did, was essentially alert Nancy, SOS, and the town, and Dudley early on, before Aristotle Onassis and his men had an opportunity to develop their plans and get to a point where they couldn't be opposed. The second thing that Public Occurrences did was throughout, this is just one example, but throughout the period, they continued to publish all sorts of reports. Nancy's had one of the committee in SOS called the Technical Committee. Karen Maurer was the head of that technical committee, and she got a lot of the university professors to study the economics, to study the engineering, to do these various studies. And they were the ones who came up with these reports, which then were shared not only with SOS, but with Public Occurrences and published in full, so that people had the information. There was no other newspaper, no other means of communication was out there to alert people to what was going on. So Public Occurrences was really key to that whole thing. Well, before we get to 1,200 times no. Phyllis passed away in the summer of 2015. I did have an opportunity to talk with her. And her story is very poignant too, because she and her husband had founded the paper. They had difficulty at first, within 2 or 3 weeks after they got there, the CompuGraphics machine operator was got a new job. The CompuGraphics machine was needed to get all the stories and put into a template so that the template could be taken down to Plastow and then paper could be printed. So they had this big problem of what to do about a CompuGraphics operator. They put out an ad. It was answered by a young co-ed, Shauna McDuffie, but Steve, who was the sole person listed as publisher, didn't want Shauna McDuffie because she was the daughter of Jay McDuffie, who was the assistant to Governor Thompson. And so, and he didn't like Governor Thompson for various reasons, and Phyllis was saying to him, you've got to, we cannot have a paper that doesn't go to press, and we have to, you can't punish her for her father, all these things. So eventually they hired Shauna McDuffie. And the paper continued, and they were able to get, and that happened to be right before the October 5th publication. But there were some problems later on, so I wanted to read to you a segment from this, page 36. Here we go. This is at the end of one evening in November, and so it's just a brief thing. It takes about 5 minutes, but I will do it. It was close to midnight when the galleys were finally ready for Phyllis to take down to the printer. I should really back up. I should really tell you a little bit more, because it's really... The mood in Public Occurrence's office was surprisingly subdued when Phyllis returned on Thursday, November 29th, to help finish producing the paper for the next day's publication. The governor had finally made his big announcement about a proposed oil refinery on Durham Point just 2 days before, and the paper had plenty of great stories for its readers. Earlier in the day, she had left the noisy office where her husband Steve and the managing editor, Dick Levine, were arguing vociferously over some goddamn trivial point about the layout. It was a weekly ritual that was driving her and everyone else in the office crazy. She didn't want to think about how many times Dick had quit in a rage only to be persuaded by her to resume his duties, or how many times Steve had walked out seething with anger. It was a relief for Phyllis to go pick up Patrick and Meredith from first grade, take them home, spend some time with them, before dinner, get them fed, bathed, and into bed, and then, once the babysitter had arrived, return to the office to finish the night's work. The unexpected calm, she realized, was a result of Steve's absence. There was, of course, the usual hum of activity, the reporters typing in their last-minute changes to their stories and talking in normal tones, while Dick worked with Shauna as she inputted other stories into the CompuGraphics machine. But no yelling or screaming, no Steve. It was odd. Typically, he and she would both stay until Dick and Shauna had finished getting the paper ready for printing, and then Phyllis would drive down to Plastow to the printer while Steve went home to the kids. Dick came over to her. She tilted her head toward Steve's office. Dick shrugged. He didn't know where Steve was. Phyllis wondered if her husband had stormed out of the office once again. When she got home, she wondered, would he be in a terrible mood? But she didn't want to get into that now. There's a lot of last-minute work that had to be done. She did all that work. It was close to midnight when the galleys were finally ready for Phyllis to take down to the printer in Plastow. When she got home and walked in the door, Steve was standing in the living room with a suitcase. She looked at him, then at the suitcase, then back at him. "I'm moving in with Shauna," he said. At first she didn't grasp what he was saying. Moving in with Shauna, the college student? Why? Did she even know about this? I'm in love with her. Phyllis dropped into a chair. She couldn't speak. She had no idea anything had been going on between the two of them. God, how long had Shauna even been working for them? Seemed like they had just hired her. But no, it must have been last month, or maybe 2 months ago. She couldn't begin to imagine how they had found time together. Her own life was a blur, taking care of the kids before they left for school and after school was over. And in between those times, driving into the Newmarket office, and if not there, then to the many businesses in the Seacoast area that were willing to advertise in their paper, never knowing exactly where Steve was at any given time, but always trusting that he was doing what needed to be done to keep the joint venture going, trusting that she really needed to think this, that he still loved her. And I'm leaving the paper, he said. We should sell it if we can, or just fold it up. We've lost half our investment. And we'll run out of the other half in a couple of months. Running out of money? He had never said anything about running out of money before. How could that be? They had started with $1 million, their nest egg. They had saved it together from their investment in the Maryland paper, and now 3 months later it was almost gone. She was barely able to murmur, where did it all go? Things were more expensive than I expected. The office, the salaries, typewriters, copygraphic machine, it all adds up. We can sell some of it, get some of the money back. She couldn't believe he was giving up everything he had said he ever wanted. Giving up his dream of running his own newspaper, of being a voice for the people, giving up his children, giving up her. I'm not quitting, she said, her voice more firm now. If you want to give up everything for her, for Shauna, go ahead. But I'm no quitter. He shrugged. Fine, I don't care what you do. Keep the whole thing. Run it into the ground. I don't want any part of it. He picked up his suitcase and walked to the door. I'll come back later to pick up the rest of my stuff. Phyllis didn't move from the chair. She sat there for a very long time, unable to make sense of what had just happened. Her mind a blur of memories and feelings and colors. Her only concrete thought, who's going to run the copygraphic machine? Well, she did keep with it, and ultimately the paper was nominated for Pulitzer Prize, as was Bob Nelson, the cartoonist. We also know that the town voted against it, 1,200 times no, that's covered in the public occurrences. This is a picture of where the House voted. It's a blurry picture, but it's the only one that Dudley had that I could find. And that was, of course, an historic vote. And at the end, in the 40th anniversary of the vote of March 74, Dale Valena proposed a memorial bench that's out on Emery Farm. No, Wagon Hill Farm, which belongs to Durham. And Dennis Robinson, a longtime friend of Dudley's and Nancy's, and also an occasional contributor, public opinion, took this picture of the three of them. Durham says no to Olympic Refinery, and there it ultimately was a final success. There's more, of course, in the book about what happens to the individual people, and if you have any questions you want to ask of Nancy and of Dudley, feel free. Thank you. No questions? Okay. Okay.
I just want to say thank you very much. I grew up in South York, Maine, and we were very grateful to you because not only was it Durham Point, it was all of us in that area that would have been destroyed. So thank you very, very much for all you did.
Yeah, I had a question about the villain in this piece, or actually there are several villains, but Mr. Onassis, did he make an appearance? To what extent was he involved in a public way in all of this?
Yes. He did come to New Hampshire, and he came and visited with the governor, and he visited with the publisher of the Union Leader, and he had a helicopter flyover over Durham, and the people of Durham, it had snowed people of Durham were out there with signs so that he could read as he would fly over. Ari, go home. And not here. And Sharon Meeker, actually, one of the people who worked with Nancy, drove down to Adams Point where the helicopter was coming and where Onassis was going to get off, take a drive around. But apparently, when she got down there, the helicopter had gone on because Onassis did not want to get down and go around the area after he'd seen those signs. And the governor's limousine with him scowling at Sharon as she was going one way with anti-refinery signs and he was going the other way. But then he also went to Bedford, and both Nancy and Dudley have good stories to tell about what happened at that conference in Bedford. Does anybody want to have them? Anybody have any other pressing questions? Because Nancy, you could tell what happened to you, and Dudley, what happened to you. Oh, yeah. What other? Well, what? Yeah.
So, a victory against a huge oil company is so rare and so beautiful. I'm just curious to hear if you have any advice for folks who are organizing today to stop the Granite Bridge pipeline proposal and the Eversource project under Great Bay.
Okay. I'm not going to answer that question right now. What I am going to do is ask Nancy and Dudley if they want to come up and give me. The visit by Onassis was a big deal. It came in December, and it was a big deal for him, and they thought that he was going to be able, with his charm, to persuade the people of the state to support it. But, go ahead, Nancy, you have.
Well, I was just going to say that advice to anybody fighting anything is that you just can't underestimate what a small group of people can do. Just to get the word out, talk to your neighbors, and if it's, and they will join you if you have a poignant message and an important battle. I mean, you can carry it forth. And you mentioned about the threat to Little Bay. I am the curator of the Durham Historic Association. We are interveners in that regard, protecting the historic resources in Durham, but there are many other interveners against that 115 kilowatt transmission line that is trying to, Eversource is trying to bring electricity from Hydro-Quebec to Massachusetts and Connecticut, and they need a connection from the Bow Station through the seacoast and then going south. And the crossing of Little Bay, we fear, is going to, they're going to be using a jet plow to create a 8-foot deep trench through the sediments, and that's going to lift up all those sediments that have held toxins from 120 years from various power plants in the Portsmouth area, the Navy Yard, and we just fear the impact on the estuarine system, which has already been compromised by not the humans around the bay, despite our efforts to conserve land. So it's going to be a very tough battle because we all need electricity, but we are feeling that this particular plan has not been well thought out. It's depending on old data about where our energy resources can come from, and people are doing so much more with energy alternatives now, and that needs to be factored into the mix about where we're going to get our energy from. But I guess that's my advice is don't be shy, talk to your neighbors, spread the word, and fight the good fight.
Nancy, could I ask you something? How would you combine, talk to your neighbors and get organized with what kind of legal help you did have or you think you should have in situations like that?
Well, you just have to prevail on, you just keep linking, networking to find lawyers who are willing to help and give you advice. We had some angels that helped us when they knew we needed, we were setting up to do a battle on 3 fronts, the local level, the state level, and we might have to go to the federal level if the state of New Hampshire overruled Durham, and then the feds got involved with energy siting. So we needed lawyers at those later levels, and we had to hire them, and there were angels who gave us the money to retain those lawyers. We only had to use the state lawyer, and the other one was just kind of on standby. But trying to understand the legal situation was the most challenging for a non-lawyer. But really the battle, you need lawyers, but it's really a battle of ideas about values, of what kinds of communities we want in the Seacoast. I think someone was asking today about, my stick. I have some balance issues, so Aristotle threw me a little off balance, but
It's still standing.
it's still standing, thank you. I hope I haven't lost my train of thought. What I wanted to say is, I think we are so fortunate that we can see the win that we made from 44 years ago when we look at the bay, when we look at the seacoast and all the watersheds that we're all trying to protect by conserving land along the coast, and there are bigger organizations that have been helping us do that. But that's made a huge difference. I think the Onassis battle made everybody realize what we have in the seacoast. It's something so very special. It's the people, it's the environment, it's the way of life that we have that's worth saving, and it still is. I mean, we've been doing many battles since the Onassis battle. They're smaller ones, but they're important too. So, but I think we really had a big win with that one in so many ways. So.
Might be better to use. Yeah, well, very good.
I just thought I'd tell you a little bit about the time Onassis came to New Hampshire. He came very shortly after it had been revealed that the plan for all of the optioned land was for there to be an oil refinery there. And the state was really agitated in one way or another. It was very exciting. And the headline in Mr. Loeb's paper was, I think, the big O,
Too big oil.
two big O's coming at Christmas. Big oil and big Onassis. And it was appalling. Anyway, but he did have a reception for the legislators in Manchester at the Wayfarer Hotel. And it was to be a very elegant reception. Invitations came by telegram. I did not get a telegram. And I learned, and I don't know how, that there's a place in New Jersey you can call and you can say, I thought I was going to get a telegram. Did you mean to send me one? And they will tell you yes or no, and they told me no. So that was pretty much that. But I also knew that he was holding a press conference that day, so I wasn't going to crash the reception, but I did go to the press conference, and I stood right next to him, and he was standing right beside the governor. There were probably 100 people in a very small room, all reporters from one place or another, or governor or somebody special. Anyway, and the governor kept nudging Onassis and saying, tell them what you're going to do, tell them what you're going to do. And Onassis just demurred, no. And then, but Thompson kept doing it. And finally, Onassis said to Thompson, you tell them. And so Thompson said, Mr. Onassis has very graciously offered to give a pollution control lab to the University of New Hampshire. The irony of it was lost on no one. Anyway, it was a great moment.
Any other questions? Go, yeah.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about this seashell, am I pronouncing it right? Seashell Alliance?
Clamshell.
Yeah, anyway. But ultimately that wasn't successful, at least in stopping the construction. You know, were you two involved, and you know, what went different?
I can tell you a little bit about that, because it helped us a lot. Can you all hear me if I don't?
Yeah, you're fine.
Okay. The nuclear power plant was already in Seabrook, and despite the efforts of the Seacoast, the Clamshell Alliance, and the Seacoast Anti-Pollution League. But we Save Our Shores turned to the Seacoast Anti-Pollution League and said, tell us what we need to know about organizing a group to fight something. We knew they battled hard. And the advice was, battle hard at the local level. That's where they lost. The nuclear power plant people were able to convince the selectmen and the people of Seabrook that this was going to be a great panacea for their town. The people bought all the promises and voted it in, said, yes, we'll accept it. So once that's done, it's really hard to fight something. So Seacoast Anti-Pollution League didn't even get involved until it became a state issue, you know, a bigger environmental issue. So their advice to us was to fight the good fight right at the beginning and convince the town that it's why it's this refinery isn't good for a town. So we took that very excellent advice because they hadn't been able to get in on that, you know, first level and win there. So you need to get on top of it right away so that it's a local vote. And that means educating the local population to what's at stake. And a lot of times you don't, you know, they don't get the whole message. We were incredibly lucky. We tapped a whole bunch of towns all over the country about Benicia, California, Texas, New Jersey, what they'd gone through in their one industry towns and what it means when an oil refinery takes over a town. It's not a good fit for a New Hampshire town.
Okay.
One
Anyone else?
last thing, as someone who works for a company that's in Benicia, California, thank you so much. You can't even imagine what it looks like out there in the refineries, in a beautiful area, and it just...
Isn't that a refinery though that had like 73 gallons,
Right.
73,000 gallons
Yep.
of oil per day, which was, 73 compared to 400,000. So if it's as bad in Benicia, California, you kind of know what it's done to New Hampshire. Yeah.
I was just going to, do you know with the nuclear power plant, did it start the same way? Did they start to clandestinely getting options on private land to buy? Is this how it always starts before they announce
I
their
don't
plans?
I don't know either.
I mean,
Sorry.
Someone should.
and in Durham, how did did these landowners or homeowners concede to do an auction? Where they just offered so much money, they weren't even asking what it was going to be for, or?
No, they were totally duped into it. There are 3 or 4 people who would, as individually, would go around and approach a landowner and say, my son and I am looking for a hunting camp because I want to teach my son how to hunt. Or I'm retiring after so many years working and I'm looking for a quiet place. You know, stories. I mean, they were totally duped into optioning their land. And when they found out, they were mad, and that's when they called lawyers, and that's how Phyllis found out about it, through a lawyer that shared what was going on. So
Could they have backed out? I mean, did they sign a contract that if it passed, they had to sell?
I think they were trying to get out of their agreements. Evelyn Brown, you saw her picture in the paper, she was fit to be tied because she was very much an environmentalist. She was a physical education instructor at UNH. She took her students hiking all over Durham. She was a history and phys ed instructor, kind of like a Pied Piper. So this was just the worst thing that could happen. But she totally fell for the idea of a father and son in a hunting camp, because she'd grown up in Banff, Lake Louise area out west.
That technique has been used, in the fracking, in Pennsylvania. They would, but once you sign it, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not giving anybody any advice. And if you give me $150,000, $130,000, I won't say anything. But what I can say is that the contract, there's a copy of the contract that was published in Public Occurrences. And when you read the contract, there's nothing in there that says it's going to be used for this purpose or that purpose. They just, for the money, they give an option to buy. And then they had a certain amount of time in which to exercise that option. So they bought up 3,000 acres, but it was all in options. And so they had to pay for the options. But then if they exercised the options, then they would have had to pay more money. So there was, that's the way the option, to pay for the option was a minor amount, but to actually go through with it was the full price, what they agreed to. Yeah.
So with respect to the new pipeline, the new gas pipeline that's proposed to come from Manchester to Stratham, actually the gas is going to flow from Stratham to Manchester, but it's 27 miles, and the state legislature approved a corridor along 101 in 2016, so they have the land already. They don't have to ask for eminent domain or anything. So they approved this corridor, so obviously the utilities were working hard at that legislation so they could put more gas pipelines in.
Well, there's eminent domain, there's one way to do it.
But if they own the corridor along 101, so they can just they don't have to ask any landowners for eminent domain. Because they own that, which is probably a good way. If you're going to do pipelines, it's probably a good way to put them in. But the question is, do we need this pipeline? Do we need more fracked gas in this area?
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think in that way, the story about what happened 44 years ago is kind of symbolic or representative of the ongoing struggle, essentially the ongoing struggle between local communities and the state, local communities, and the powers of energy companies, which have really grown tremendously. So it's hard to know whether the same effort this time by an Onassis would result in the same way. But at least there is an example of what to do. Organize at the local level, have heroes who lead you
And at the very least, it's an inspiration, what you have done, Nancy and Dudley, for all of us now that are fighting Eversource and the gas line and whatever.
Yeah.
If you could do it, I keep saying that maybe we can do it too.
Absolutely.
That's right, okay.
Great, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much.